Have you ever wondered what a buffer overflow is or how it can affect your computer system? Well, let's break it down. In the realm of computers, a buffer is like a temporary storage spot for data. It's a bit like a waiting room for information where it's held until your computer's processor is ready to deal with it. Now imagine that this waiting room has a set capacity. It can only hold so much data at once. But what if more data comes along than the buffer can handle? This is where we encounter a buffer overflow. Just like a cup spilling over when it's filled too much. A buffer overflow occurs when more data is loaded into a buffer than it can hold. Buffers play a crucial role in how your computer uses and manages memory. They help keep things running smoothly. But when an overflow happens, it can cause all sorts of problems. That's the basics of what a buffer overflow is. But how does it work? Let's dive deeper.
To understand buffer overflows, we need to know how data is stored in memory. Just like a library has shelves to store books, a computer has memory to store data. This memory is organized into sections, kind of like aisles in a library. Each section of memory is assigned a unique address, just like each aisle in a library has a unique identifier. Now let's talk about buffers. Buffers are temporary storage spots in memory where data waits before it's processed. Imagine them as small carts that hold the books before they're placed on the library shelves. The size of the buffer, much like the size of the cart, is predefined. It can only hold a certain amount of data, or in our analogy, a certain number of books. When data is loaded into a buffer, it's like loading books onto a cart. If the buffer is not full, everything works smoothly. The data waits its turn, then gets processed, just like the books wait on the cart until they're placed on the shelves. But what if too much data is loaded into the buffer? What if someone tries to load more books onto the cart than it can hold? This is where buffer overflows come into play. In a buffer overflow, the buffer can't hold all the data that's been loaded into it. The excess data spills over into adjacent memory sections. It's like if someone overloaded a library cart and the books spilled onto the floor, blocking the aisle. Memory addresses are crucial in a buffer overflow because they dictate where the data should go. In our library analogy, the memory address is like the aisle number. If books spill onto the floor and block an aisle, it's a big problem. Similarly, when data spills over into adjacent memory sections due to a buffer overflow, it can corrupt data or even cause the system to crash. Now that we know how memory and buffers work, let's see what happens when a buffer overflow occurs. So what happens when there's too much data and not enough buffer? Imagine a freight train barreling down the tracks at a high speed. The train is filled to capacity, but it's still being loaded with more and more cargo. Eventually, the excess cargo starts to spill over, causing chaos and disruption. This, in essence, is what happens during a buffer overflow. When a program receives more data than it can handle, the excess data overflows the buffer, which is the temporary storage space in the computer's memory. This overflow can overwrite adjacent memory spaces, much like the cargo from our freight train spilling onto the tracks. Now, you might be thinking, so what? It's just a bit of extra data. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, we mean potentially disastrous. When the buffer overflows, it can overwrite essential data and disrupt the normal functioning of the system. It's like a domino effect. One small disruption can lead to a cascade of problems. The system might crash, or worse, the overflow could lead to unauthorized access to system memory. Think of it this way. Imagine you're in a library and you're only allowed to read the books on one particular shelf. But then a buffer overflow happens and suddenly you can reach books on all the shelves. You now have access to information you weren't supposed to see. That's what can happen when a buffer overflow allows unauthorized access to system memory. In the world of cybersecurity, buffer overflows are often exploited by hackers to manipulate a system or gain access to sensitive information. It's like giving a burglar the keys to your house, not an ideal situation, to say the least. As you can see, buffer overflows can lead to serious problems.
But can they be prevented? The answer is yes. A buffer overflows sound serious, but there are ways to prevent them. Let's delve into some of the effective methods to nip this issue in the bud. Firstly, input validation is a vital preventive measure. By ensuring that data received from user inputs or external sources is of the expected type, and within the expected range, we can avoid overloading the buffer. It's a bit like a bouncer at a club, only letting in the right kind of data. Next up, we have buffer overflow protection in modern operating systems. This is akin to having a built-in security guard in your system. Modern operating systems come equipped with mechanisms that can detect and prevent buffer overflows, making it harder for malicious entities to exploit this vulnerability. But prevention isn't just about relying on inbuilt mechanisms. Secure coding practices play a pivotal role too. This involves being mindful of buffer limits when writing code and using functions that limit the amount of data that can be written into buffers. Think of it as a safety belt, keeping your code secure and in place. Remember, cybersecurity is not a passive activity. It's about being proactive and vigilant. By understanding the potential weaknesses in your system, like buffer overflows, you can take the necessary steps to fortify it. By understanding and implementing these strategies, you can protect your system from the risks of buffer overflows. Don't wait for the overflow, be the plug that prevents it. Let's quickly summarize what we've learned about buffer overflows. These are bugs that occur when more data is written into a buffer than it can handle, causing a system crash or creating a vulnerability for exploitation. We've seen how they work and their potential harm, but also how to prevent them with careful coding and security measures. It's clear that understanding buffer overflows is critical in the realm of cybersecurity. Remember, understanding buffer overflows is a key step in securing your systems. Thanks for joining me today, and keep those buffers in check.